In this lesson, we are going to talk about reproduction, specifically yung reproduction in plants. Ang reproduction ay isa sa mga characteristics of life. And actually, na-establish na natin yan doon sa video ko about the characteristics of life. So maglilink na lang ako doon sa description box or doon sa comment para matingnan din natin yung mga characteristics of life. Pero dito, mas bibigyan natin ng detalye yun at magbibigay ako ng mga examples para mas madali nating maunawaan. Right? Tandaan natin doon sa reproduction yung at saka yung production. Reproduction, reproduction. Ibig sabihin to produce again. Napakahalaga ng reproduction sa mga living organisms. Kapag hindi kasi successful ang reproduction ng organisms of the same species, pwedeng maging extinct sila or maubos kasi hindi na sila dumadami. Alright? So, proceed na tayo doon sa definition. Sabi rito, reproduction among living things can be accomplished in one or two ways, asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. Ano yung difference nitong dalawa? Basically, ganito yan. In asexual reproduction, a single parent produces offspring that are identical to the parent. So, sa asexual reproduction, hindi nangyayari dyan yung union or yung fusion of sex cells or gametes. Okay? Hindi yun necessary. Okay? Ang requirement natin dyan, meron tayong isang parent, isa lang ha, na may kakayanan na mag-reproduce ng offspring na identical sa kanya, pareha sa kanya. Okay? In sexual reproduction naman, two parents are required to produce offspring whose traits come from both parents. Ito yung kabaliktaran ng asexual reproduction kasi necessary dito yung union or yung fusion ng sex cells or ng male and female gametes. Okay? Ayan, yan yung fusion ng sex cells. And yung magiging offspring sa sexual reproduction, magkakaroon siya ng mga traits na magmumula from both parents kasi involved nga dalawang parents. Okay? Nabanggit ko yung gametes. Ito pala yung sex cells lang din. Sa animals, ang male gametes ay tinatawag nating sperm cell. Sa female gametes naman ay tinatawag nating egg cell. Okay? And sa plants, specifically yung flowering plants, no, na pag-usapan na rin natin dun sa nakaraang video, dun sa structure ng flower. Yung male gametes are contained doon sa pollen. And yung pollen, yun yung pollen grains. While yung sa female gametes, tinatawag nating ovules. So, tingnan natin yung parts ng flowers para mas ma-imagine natin yung sexual reproduction sa plants. Natakal na natin yung structure ng flower and yung mga function ng parts doon sa previous video. And now, titingnan na natin yung process sa reproduction. For us to understand this, we will look into pollination, which is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the pistil. Recall lang natin, ang anther, ito yung nasa dulo ng stamen. Yung stamen, ito yung male part ng flower. Nandoon sa anther yung pollen. Okay? And yung pistil naman, ito yung female part ng isang flower. And again, na-establish na natin itong information na ito doon sa previous video natin. Going back, ang pollination ay pwedeng self-pollination or cross-pollination. Ano ang difference nitong dalawa? Sabi dito, self-pollination occurs when pollen falls from the anther into the stigma of the same flowering plant. On the other hand, cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen to another plant of the same species. Okay? Ulitin ko. Sabi dito sa self-pollination, it occurs when pollen falls from the anther into the stigma of the same flowering plant. On the other hand, cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen to another plant of the same species. So, simulan natin sa self-pollination. Ang sinasabi lang doon, kapag nag-self-pollinate ang isang flowering plant, then yung pollen doon sa isa sa mga flowers sa plant na yon ay nai-transfer, naiilipat doon sa pistil ng parehong plant na yon. Kumbaga, kung saan nanggaling yung pollen, doon din mismo itatransfer yung pollen. Kaya nga self-pollination Okay? Ipapakita ko yung picture ng self-pollination. Dito sa ating illustration, yung letters A and B ay yung self-pollination. Meron pa kasi itong dalawang uri, but we're not looking too much into details. Yun yung autogamy at saka yung geitonogamy. So, i-define din natin autogamy is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of within same flower, whereas geitonogamy generally represents the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of another flower of the same plants. Okay? Ang pinagkaiba ng dalawa sa autogamy, yung pollen ng isang flower ay tinatransfer sa pistil noong flower na pinanggalingan niya mismo. So kung saang flower nang galing yung pollen, doon din mismo sa flower na yun ibibigay yung pollen. Okay? Sa gaytonogamy naman, kung saang flower nang galing yung pollen, itatransfer lang sa ibang flower, pero sa same plant mismo. Kumbaga may dalawang bulaklak na nasa iisang halaman. Ganon. Okay? Again, sa autogamy, sa iisang flower nangyayari yung self-pollination. Yung sa gaytonogamy naman, sa iisang plant pero magkaibang flower nangyayari yung self-pollination. Alright? Now, doon naman tayo sa cross-pollination, and tinatawag din itong heterogamy. Sabi dito, cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen to another plant of the same species. So dito sa ating illustration, makikita natin na yung pollen ay itina-transfer doon sa isa pang halaman, yung letter C. Okay? Of course, yung halaman na yun, generally yung angiosperm, saka yung gymnosperm na yun, dapat katulad ng angiosperm or ng gymnosperm na pinanggalingan ng sperm na contain doon sa pollen grains. Okay? At nabanggit ko yung angiosperm at saka yung gymnosperm. Ang angiosperm, ito basically yung mga flowering plants. And yung gymnosperm naman, ito yung mga cone-bearing plants. Parang may seeds na naka-expose. Tapos wala silang flower. Now, sa cross-pollination, paano kaya ito napapacilitate? Kasi hindi naman pumupunta yung isang halaman, yung isang angiosperm, yung isang gymnosperm sa kapwa niya angiosperm or gymnosperm. Tapos sasabihin, hey, na ito yung mga pollen grains ko, tapos yan, mag-fertilize ka. Hindi naman ganun, di ba? So, kailangan ng agents of pollination. Okay? Ano yung mga yun? Birds, maliliit na insects, like bees, or bubuyog, water, tsaka wind. And actually, may tawag doon sa pollination na kine-carried out ng isang certain pollinator or ng isang certain agent. Hydrophily kapag pollination by water, zoophily or pollination by animals, anemophily or pollination by wind, entomophily or pollination by insect, ornithophily or yung pollination by birds. And so doon sa zoophily, entomophily, ornithophily, may reward yung mga insects and birds like yung nectar na nakukuha nila doon sa flower. Right? And ayun, yun yung sexual reproduction sa plants, pollination. But sabi dito, many plants can also reproduce asexually. Ano nga kapag sinabing asexual reproduction? Single parent lang ang involved. Okay? Question, paano nagte-take place ang asexual reproduction sa plants? To know this, we'll just look into budding and vegetative propagation. Dalawa lang yung budding tsaka yung vegetative propagation. Kasi sa next video natin, mas makikita natin yung method of reproduction sa iba pang species. Especially yung mga nasa water. Okay? So pagbukurin natin, First is yung budding. I-define muna natin. According to Britannica.com, budding is a form of asexual reproduction in which a new individual develops from some generative anatomical point of the parent organism. In some species, buds may be produced from almost any point of the body, but in many cases, budding is restricted to specialized areas. Okay? Now, sa budding, merong particular part or site doon sa plant kung saan magkakaroon ng outgrowth. And yung bud na yun, yung outgrowth na yun, ay may ability para mag-form into a new individual. Nagde-detach yun doon sa parent. Okay? Now, bakit nagkakaroon pala ng bud? That is because of cell division of somatic cells, hindi sex cells. Kasi kapag involved na ang sex cells, sexual reproduction na yun. Okay? Ano nga ulit ang somatic cells? Yun yung mga cells other than sex cells. Okay? Next is vegetative propagation. Ito ay naituro na noong elementary pa lang tayo doon sa, parang TLE siya na subject doon sa high school. Pero sa elementary, parang EPP yata yun. Yung edukasyong pantahanan at pangkabuhayan. Okay? I-define muna natin. Vegetative propagation is an asexual method of plant reproduction that occurs in its leaves, roots, and stem. This can occur through fragmentation and regeneration of specific vegetative parts of plants. Sa ganitong uri ng asexual reproduction, merong part doon sa plant na may reproductive structure. Ito yung tinatawag nating vegetative propagules. And yun yung may ability to form a new individual. Okay? Ano yung halimbawa ng reproductive structure na yon or ng vegetative propagules? Stolon. Yan, itong nakikita natin sa picture. Mapapansin natin ito sa mga halaman, may parang ugat. Okay? May parang ugat dun sa stem na yun, dun sa stolon. At dun sa site na yun, may sumisibol din na panibagong plant. For example, is yung sa strawberry. Okay? Now, i-emphasize ko kapag asexual reproduction, asexual, ang napuproduce na offspring ay genetically the same. Genetically identical doon sa parent. Kasi walang fusion ng male and female gametes na nangyari. Alright? Again, sa asexual reproduction, ang offspring na napuproduce mula doon sa parent ay genetically identical doon sa parent. Okay? Again, napag-usapan natin na ang plants ay pwedeng mag-reproduce sexually via self-pollination or cross-pollination, and pwede rin mag-reproduce asexually, for instance, via budding and vegetative propagation. Ang reproduction, it can be processed naturally, so natural nangyayari yan, and pwede rin with the help of humans, especially kapag asexual reproduction. Okay? Dito ang focus lang natin is sa plants. Of course, napakahalaga ng plant reproduction. Especially sa agriculture, horticulture, ayan. So, yun lang para sa ating lesson. Thank you for watching and sana natuto kayo.